Hey, how's it going? And today I'm excited to bring you this tutorial on how to make fire in LightWave. If you're wondering why you don't see a lot of tutorials on how to make fire, it's because I think you got to be a little bit OCD, not only to go through all the steps, but also to put the tutorial together. And so there are quite a few steps and settings, but basically you'll end up something that looks like that, which I think looks pretty great. Now this is based on the old way of doing it using Hypervoxels, and the newer method is they recommend using Volumetric Primitives using the Nodal editor. They still have Hypervoxels in 2018 and LightWave 2018, so it's a tried and true method, and so that's the method I'm going to use. Then once you understand this method, you just need to translate it over into the Nodal editor. But as you'll see, there's a lot to it. A couple things I want to make a point of is the whole concept behind making fire. If you think about what fire is, it's very dynamic and it's constantly changing. And you can think of a particle of fire as changing on a number of parameters over time. So you can think of like of a human, like you got child, a teenager, an adult, and an old person. And over time changes on a number of dimensions. And so it's the same thing with fire. It starts out small and it gets bigger. Its luminosity changes over time. Its color changes over time. The density changes over time. And so basically what we're doing is we're, through the gradients and the textures, we're actually controlling everything. So this is the one I'd been working on. It took me about a half hour to go through all the steps to create what you see right now on the screen. And what I'm going to do seems crazy. I'm just going to go ahead and clear it all out, and we're going to start from scratch. And I'm going to do it in real time to show you how to get started. Okay, so the first thing is we're going to go to null and create a null and go OK. And there's our null. Great, fantastic. And that's how you make fire, folks. It's it's a little bit more than that. Okay, so here we go. So I actually have to follow some notes on this because I honestly don't have everything committed to memory. Please note on these settings that you can experiment with them and play with them. So if I give you a color or a number, don't worry about it. Just kind of get it in the ballpark, and then you can tweak things later. So here we go. Okay, so we got our null created. The first thing, I'm just going to switch to camera view just for a second, just to reposition myself. So I'm going to click on the camera, and I'm going to go to one side like that. And then on the Y, I'm just going to bring it down a little bit so I know I'm positioned correctly. And then I can just go back into perspective view and click on the object. I can even zoom in a little tiny bit. Now, the one thing to know about this before you go insane is that you want to make sure that you click on render properties, and then on the volumetrics tab, make sure that you got enable volumetrics and use legacy volumetrics, and then you can close that. And then if you want, you can just go into VPR, and at some point you'll start seeing something, but we're not quite there yet. So actually you don't see anything in VPR. So I'm all selected. We're going to go into properties, and we're going to go up here. There's these 7 tabs. We just want the one that says appearance, and the first thing we're going to click is Hypervoxel drawing, and then the next thing we're going to click is FX emitter, and that's what's going to generate here. And there's a few settings that we need to play around with real fast, so we're going to do that. Just give me one little second here as I double check on my notes here. So here we go. The first one is on the generator. The last 3 tabs we don't need to worry about. These, we can just leave these all on the default, except we want to change the generator size to 500 millimeters. So we're just going to go 0.5 and 0.5 and 0.5. And there we go. Okay. And then we're just going to move on to the next tab, which is particles. You can add some variability here. So what we're going to do is we're going to say particle weight is 1, and then give it a range of like 0.25. So plus or minus 0.25. And then here under no particle size there, under particle resistance, we're going to change that to 0.45. 0.45. And then under life, we're going to change this to 35, and then we're going to change this to 5. Okay, and those are the settings there, so you can stop the video and take note of it if you want. And then under motion, we're just going to click world coordinates. We're going to leave all these the same otherwise, so no changes there. Under etc., which I always thought was a kind of a catch-all. Under the Y for gravity, we're going to put 4. And then under parent motion, we're going to change that to 20. And then under rotation, we're going to change this to random rotation and scale. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to kind of run through those real fast now that we've done them. So what we've got here is we've got everything default except 500, 500, 500. On particles, we have everything pretty much the default, except we add some variability in there. 0.25 under particle weight, 0.45 under resistance. We drop the lifetime time frame down to 35, and then 5 for our variable. We don't check anything there. Under motion, we leave everything as is, except we check world coordinates. And then under etc., we're going to have gravity is 4, and then our parent motion is 25. And then rotation, we click that and do that. So you want to make sure you double check your settings on this. So this is where the OCD part comes in, because if you leave off just one setting, sometimes you end up having an issue, and then you go back trying to figure it out. And if you'd just been more OCD or careful in the first place, you wouldn't have missed it. And then you can save yourself a lot of frustration and aggravation that way. Okay, so now we're done with that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to come into the backdrop over here. We're going to turn off the gradient backdrop. We're going to go into Legacy Volumetrics. We're going to add Hypervoxels. There they are. And we double click on this. And there we go. So this is the home stretch of the whole thing, but it's a little bit time consuming to run through all these settings and setting up all your keyframing and stuff. And this is why I think you don't see many tutorials like this, because it's a little bit of a pain, to be honest with you. So here we go. We're going to click on null, and we're going to go activate, and that lightens everything up. Now, the one thing to be sure you do, this is easy to make a misstep here, is right off the top here under particles, make sure you change the object type to volume, because that's what you're dealing with. And the dissolve stays to 0. Now we're going to set a lot of textures and things like that. So the very first one we're going to set is here, up here, if we click on that T. And what we're going to do is we are going to add a gradient with 4 keyframes. So we're going to go from image map to gradient. We'll leave all those the same. Now we're going to come in here, and we have 1 keyframe. See, we have that at 100%. Then we're going to, about maybe a fifth of the way down, you're going to click, and you're going to change this one to 0 alpha. And then you're going to go about at 16th of the way down, like about that far, not too far. And you're going to just bring it up a little bit to 4. And then you come all the way down to the bottom, and you just click to create the keyframe and drag it down a little bit. And we're going to put this one back to 100, like that. And so let's, we got 100. So let's double check, make sure we got everything right. 100, 0, 4, 100. And then we're done with this one. And make sure you're on textures, Hypervoxel, dissolve. And that'll make our particle kind of come in and fade out and come back in. Okay. And that's a nice touch to our fire right there. We're going to close that, and then we are done with that. There's quite a few of these to do, so you might want to get yourself something cold to drink. Now for the rest of these settings on the geometry page, we're just going to go ahead and set this. You can type in 0.9, 90 millimeters for that. And then the size variation, we want 100%. Got that. Okay. And 900, line to path is off. And all the rest of this. So let's check that. 90 mm, 100% variation, no line to path, and everything else just stays on the default. Okay, great. Now we're going to go in and add a gradient on our particle size. So we click here on the T, brings up the gradient. Again, we're going to go to gradient. You see here, that's one thing to double check, is make sure that your input parameter, and I should know better than this, is make sure your input parameter is set to relative particle age. And that's for every single one. And that actually will cause a problem. So excuse me for missing that step. So we have relative particle age, and that's where you can verify that it's set correctly. It'll say it right over here. So almost all these should say G relative particle. And then there's some that'll say local density, and then there's just one that'll be procedural. So that's something to double check and make sure we got that set correctly. And that one's good. So I actually made a mistake right there and caught it. Okay, and now here we are. We're back. We want to set this not to previous layer, but to... So make sure you set your gradient. You'll set your relative particle age. Okay, and now what we're going to do is we're going to add 2 keyframes here. There's one already set, but we're going to put the... Actually, I take that back. We're going to set 3 keyframes here. So the first one The first one is going to be 100%. So that's set already. So then you come about like a fifth of the way down and click here. And we're going to change this to 200%. And then we're going to come all the way down to the bottom and change that to 300%. And there you go. And that one's set. So this will change the size of our particle. Like, so if it was in my previous example of a human, it would be this person's going to be getting bigger over time, right? So bigger right away and then gradually bigger from. So check sure you got 100. That shouldn't be 300. What happened there, right? This one should be 200. So that's why it's good to double check all these. So this should be 200 here. Enter. And then this one is going to be 300. There we go. And just drag that down a little bit. So double check. We got gradient, relative particle age, ... And we should be good. So that's 100, 200, and 300. And we're good there. Okay. And now let's see where we're at. We're done with our geometry tab. So we've added our 2 gradients. Actually, here we added 1 layer and then 1 there. Okay. And now we're going to move on to shading. Believe it or not, we still got a ways to go here. So what we're going to do next is with regard to the color. So make sure you're on the basic tab here. And let's just put this color here to and you can pick any colors you want, but I put 230. Oops, the heck happened there? 230, 132, and then this is all zeros. 1, 2, 3, and there's our yellow color, and just go OK. And then what we're going to do here is to click on texture here, and we've got, this is the tab we have the most work to work on. So let's go to texture, and we're going to do a couple things here. There's 2 layers we're going to add here. The first one, we can go here, add layer. Oh, here I messed up. Let me just do this. Sorry. Okay, we'll click this and go gradient, and this is going to be normal. And this one, the input is going to be local density here. And here we're going to have a color. We're going to have a color change from the beginning to the end. So our first color, if we set our first keyframe, we're going to click here. And our first color, and again, you can play around with these. I have 219 and 116, 016, and then 0. And go OK. And then that's kind of a nice orange color. And then now what we're going to do is click down here at the bottom and create another keyframe. And we're going to change this color to a yellow color. So that color I'm choosing. So this means that the flame is going to start out orange and eventually transition to yellow. So for that I have, this one I have 191. Oops. 191. 190, 143, and then also 0, and go OK. And you can see there's our nice change. So this is local density, and then we can come and click it here and add another layer, and this is again is a gradient, but this is going to be again, I think all the rest now will just be, the input's going to be the relative particle age again. And so this one is going to add a red. It's actually going to go from an orange to a reddish. So here we're going to click here, and the color that I chose for this is 127.34. So it's like 127 and then 0.34, and that's all 0 zeros right here. The opacity is actually at 50%. Oh, go OK here. And we're going to put the opacity at 50% there. And then what we're going to do is just click another keyframe here, put another keyframe here, kind of lock it at that position so it doesn't change. And then, so it's going to be like embers kind of. And then we're going to click and make one more keyframe. We just create the keyframe by clicking, drag this to the end. And our color here is actually going to be just 1910. So you just go 191. And then we're going to go 0, 0, 0, And then there's our nice red, and we go there. And then our opacity here is going to go up to 100. And that's that. So we have our two, wait, that one should be clicked on. Yeah, so we make sure we got our local density and our relative path. So there's this one, and then there's this one. Okay, and that is for hypervoxel color. And then that's it for that. Now this one is the most involved one, the luminosity. And if you think about fire, right, of course it changes in luminosity as it goes through in time. So here we're going to start out with, we're going to go to gradient again, and we're going to go to, let's do local density. And for this one's only 2 keyframes, and it's going to start out at a value here of 0, like not any density in the beginning. And then, wait, I take that back. Our first one is going to start off, I messed up on that. Okay, this first one's actually really high. It's going to be 20,000. So it's going to be very dense. And then we're going to come down here, and the value is going to change. So at the end, it's very not dense. That's going to be 0. So it should look like that. And we can pull this down. That shouldn't be up so high. Wait, is that an extra keyframe in there? Okay, so I actually added one I shouldn't have added. Okay, so this one should be 20,000. This one should be 0. And we can pull that down and make sure that's all right. And that's our local density layer under luminosity. Now we're going to go ahead and add a layer, gradient, and we're going to change this to relative. So let's see what we got here. So for this one, we've got 2 keyframes, and the first one is going to be a value of 10,000. So let's pop in 10,000. And the alpha is going to be 50%. And there's that. And then we'll add one about halfway down, like right about there. And that one is going to be 1,000. So our luminosity is going to drop pretty quick, as you would expect it to, and disappear actually. So this is going to drop to 0 there. So you're just thinking about how the dimensions on which fire changes. In luminosity, it starts out very luminous, and then it basically goes away because it's exhaust, it's burn up the fuel, right? So we got those all set. And then one last layer, we're going to go add layer, and this one is going to be a little different. It's going to be a procedural, and that should be fun. And the type is going to be turbulence. It's already selected. And our texture value, we're going to put that at 100%. And the frequencies, we're going to leave that at 3. Contrast, we're going to put at 50. And all this stays the same. 0.5, I mean. So we have 100, 3, 50%, and 0.5. And everything else looks good there. Don't see anything there. And so make sure on your texture, hypervoxel, luminosity, you've got turbulence, relative, particle, and local density, and we close that out. And then the last, not least, is our density again. And under there, let's see what we got here. We're going to add 4 keyframes. So the input is going to be a procedural texture, and oh no, I'm sorry, it's going to be a gradient. So it's going to be a gradient, and then it's going to be the relative particle age. And then our first keyframe is just going to be what it is. It's already set. And to come like about maybe a fourth of the way down and click right there to add a keyframe. And we're going to set this one to our value to 440. That, and the alpha stays there. And then just a little bit underneath that, like right about there, we want our density to increase. So this is going to go just a little bit, so that we're going to go to 460 there. And then the last keyframe, we're going to click down here to add it. And that one is going to be 200%. So you can see there's lots of room for experimentation with this. This is just a lot of stuff. So my big question is this going to actually work? after we're done with all this. So hopefully you're following along, and believe it or not, we're getting there. Now this one is really a big one. If you make a mistake on this one, you can really mess up the whole thing. So we're going to come in here to hypertexture, and this is, of all the settings, this is probably the biggest one, the biggest influence one. So okay, so we're on hypertexture, and we want to change this to turbulence. This is really what makes it a flame. So you've probably been wondering what the heck's going on. I mean, you're doing all this stuff where I don't see anything. So let me switch to camera view here, and let's switch to VPR. So you've been waiting long enough, and then you don't see anything, right? But we hit play, and there we go. So now what I was telling you earlier was, you've been adding all these settings and you haven't seen anything, but now you can see kind of what you're creating, right? But you notice it doesn't look anything at all like fire, right? But then I was just mentioning that the one setting that we're getting ready to add is really the big one, right? So it doesn't look like anything like fire yet, right? Just hold on a second and I'll show you. So we come back into backdrop, legacy, double click Hypervoxels, and so let's go to hypertexture. We got turbulence, and so this is the one that really. So we set our frequencies is contrast is 0, that is 0. Texture effect is dissolve. So we took that, and let's see what else we got here. Set all these to 2. You should start seeing some. See, right now I would say that light is probably blowing it out right now. So we have everything, right? The frequencies, the texture amplitude is going to be 0. So we don't want any. That can't be right. It doesn't look right, does it? It looked better the way it was. Hold on. Now see, this is my thing of where I must have missed a step somewhere along the way again, because that doesn't look anything right yet. So hyper, texture, turbulence, frequencies, texture amplitude, 0, dissolve. Oh, 25%. That didn't do it either, right? Texture amplitude. Oh, so we're going to come in here and add a gradient, and see, this is what's going to do it, I bet you, for you. So we're going to set it to gradient, and we're going to go to particle, relative particle weight, and our keyframe here is going to, let's see, we got 3 keyframes. So our first value is going to be 0. And our alpha is going to be that. Is that right? And then we're going to add another keyframe right after that. Bring it down a little bit. And it's going to be, our value is going to be 50%. 50%. And then our alpha is 100. And then we're going to come down here. And where are we at with that? We're going to have 100, 100. Put our 100, 100. And let me see. So now I think if we come in here and we look, and we go to back to shading, and we go to advanced, we'll set this to very good. And one more setting here. So advanced, is that right? Advanced, let me get this here. That's good. We'll turn off volumetric shading. If I turn and I come ambient intensity, everything else is right. So let me come in here to the lights and the properties on my light and turn the light down, like way down, like even more down than that. So let's I don't even have a light. Let's just turn off the light. So that's what I ended up with. Like, this is what I've ended up with going through all these settings. So, and if you hit play, it runs through. So each time I do this, I end up with a little bit different effect. It's just one of those things that you have to play around with, the different settings. So let me just double check a couple things here. If I go back to geometry, let's just run through our settings and make sure I didn't really mess something up here. Relative particle, that's right. That looks right. It just seems like it's a little too bright. So let me see. I'm just trying to think of what setting I could adjust to. Not the hyper texture. I'm okay with all that. It's got to be under the shading, basic shading, luminosity. Let's double check here. Luminosity. Oh, could this be right? 5,000. 5,000 and opacity, density. Let's pump this up to 400. And thickness, maybe that's what it is. It's too thick. So 3. Oh, that makes a big difference. And smoothness, we'll drop that down to like 42. So the thickness, I don't know, maybe we want a little more thick than that. The thickness is making a big difference right now. So of all the settings that you could tamper with, it looks like that's one that's really worth playing around with. So I realize this is a lot to take in. It's kind of the nature of the beast of dealing with fire. It's such a dynamic thing. There's so many settings involved. You know, I could just kind of walk through them again real fast if you wanted, but this is, you got your geometry, and we got set your object type to volume, dissolve 0, particle 90 mm, size variation 100%, turn off align to path. Most of the time you're keeping, and then you set your textures. You've got one up here for dissolve, and it's the relative particle path. You set 4 keyframes, and there's 100. The alpha is the only thing that's really changing here. You just can kind of go through the whole thing all over again and play around with it. I hope you found this helpful. I realize this was a very long tutorial. Now, the other thing that you can do once you're ready to render it out, I haven't really noticed a need to change any of the other settings, like the sample settings or anything. But I suppose if you wanted to, you could, come in here if you looked on your camera and increase your camera sample settings a little bit. But I don't know if that's really going to be necessary. I haven't really found. And when you go into render properties, you can also go, if you go into render down here, you can enable noise filtering as well. I don't think you'll have to play around too much with the other settings. The main thing, if I could summarize, I guess, is just to come into legacy volumetrics and hypervoxels, and this is where everything's got to happen. So I think the biggest place to make an error is not selecting the object type, missing a gradient layer here. So like on this one, the particle size, there's just this one. On this one, there's only one layer too. And then if you go into shading, there's one here, there's 2 layers here, there's one there and one there. But these are changing your colors at the same time, right? So you got color changes going on, dynamic color changes. Luminosity is the most complicated one with the turbulence, the relative, and this. And the other place you make an error is if in the input parameter, which is generally the local density or the relative particle age. And then as you saw, the thickness and smoothness really have a big effect. The other thing that has a big effect is the lighting. If you add, I turned this light off, but I turned it all the way down, but your lighting also has a effect. So you might want to, if you bring it in, so you can blow the whole thing out. So you probably want to just turn your light off or turn your light on and just play around and see what kind of lighting effects that you can get. I hope you found this helpful. I realize this is a long tutorial, but this is kind of an involved process. But if you kind of follow along and take some notes, you'll figure it out eventually. And hopefully, if you find a way of doing it even faster or better, or even know volumetric lighting, please feel free to share that link or comments below. I really appreciate it. So I hope you found this helpful. Take care and have a great day.